This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
We are living in a world today that is in major crisis. No question about that. We're seeing some amazing disasters happen just in the United States. And we're about to encounter another one. We're about to have a major flood hit Kansas City within the next few days because the Missouri River is flooding up north. And so it's just going to be, it's just like it goes in waves, you know, these things that happen. Things going on, the deal in Joplin is just such a horrible, horrible experience. Our church is really getting involved in that, and I'm going to ask our class to really get involved in that also. One of my, I've often said this, and I really do believe this, we have a tendency sometimes to get so involved in foreign missions that we neglect our missions here at home. And we really need to be involved locally. I mean, this is why God put us here. He put us in this place, you know, for His purposes and His plan to minister to needs here. So we're going to get really involved in the work, I believe, in Joplin and some other areas. And I'm going to ask you as a class to get involved in that. Yeah, we're going to go to Honduras probably next April. But in the meantime, there are going to be some things that we can do, weekend projects where we can go and send some people for 1 or 2 days to go do cleanup and just helping people, ministering to people and meeting those needs. We continue with our ministry up in South Dakota, of course, and a number of different areas. So I'm going to be meeting after class with a team that we're forming here at the church called First in Action, which will be a crisis team to just be a part of what's going on and helping minister to people during those crisis times. And I got to thinking about that as I was thinking about what I wanted to take a look at and teach, and I thought, you know, God says an awful lot about crisis. He says an awful lot about chaos in our lives, because we all have that in our lives at so many different times. And some of you are in it right now, some of you have been through it, some of you know that you're going to be at some point in your life dealing with some chaos in your life. You know people who are in chaos, people who are in crisis. And Jesus had some amazing things to say about that. And so I thought today we would take a look at faith in chaos. And we're going to take a look at Matthew, starting in chapter 14. The passage that we're dealing with starts with verse 13 all the way through 36. And you'll have that there in your study guides. But the more I study this passage, the more I see myself and the more I understand how frail and how useless I am without this overwhelming power of God in my life. It's not about my strength and my ability, but it's about God's power and His amazing ability to deal with issues in my life in the midst of crisis. Let me ask you some questions. What does God expect from you when things go wrong? When you find yourself in a crisis situation, when there's chaos in your life, what does God expect from you during that time? What do you do when you've done what you thought God wanted you to do and things still fell apart? When life was just a total disaster, but you knew you had to do something. I mean, it was up to you. You had some responsibility. How do you handle that when things fall apart? And here's a very important question. How do you handle crisis? How do you handle the crisis in your life? Most people use what I call the running water approach. The running water approach is basically the idea you keep the pressure from building up too high. Because if it builds up too high, then it's even going to cause a greater disaster. So you keep the pressure from building up too high, and then you follow the path of least resistance. That's the running water approach. So you keep the pressure from building up, and then you follow the path of least resistance. And that's how most people handle chaos. That's how they handle crisis in their lives. They just follow the path of least resistance and hope that things don't get worse. Through the years, I've had a unique experience of being involved in a number of corporate crisis management situations and in several disaster crisis management situations. And for a few years, I actually taught crisis management to a number of corporate leaders. And it was interesting to discover how little people know how to deal with crisis. And certainly when you get to the corporate level, it's like, oh, I don't want to have to do that. Let's hire somebody to do it for us, you know. But really, crisis management can be defined as a three-phase process. First, you have to define the real problem. Secondly, you have to apply the real solution. And then thirdly, you have to study and apply the discovery and the results of that. And really, that's an amazing, simple process. It's not as simple as it sounds, but it really is a simple, if you will, outline to follow when you're dealing with crisis. And it is exactly what Jesus did. It's exactly what Jesus taught. Basically, you define the real problem, not what the perceived problem is, but what is the real problem. And then secondly, what is the real solution to the real problem? Not what you think is the solution. In fact, it's amazing how many times people don't even know what the real problem is. They just know they got a problem, but they think it's something else instead of really focusing in on what the real problem is. And then thirdly, and this is such a missed part, once the pressure's off or they think the problem is solved, they don't follow through in discovering how to keep that problem from happening again and how to take what they've learned from that and apply it in their lives. This is the process that Jesus used to teach and to train and to develop his disciples, and that of course includes us. And it really means that this is how God still works and deals with the issues in our lives. This is a process that God uses and he expects us to use in our lives today. Now, in what we're studying today, Jesus is in the middle of his ministry. And remember, his ministry only lasted 3 years. Now, he's in this ministry, and at the end of chapter 13, we discover that things start falling apart. Not falling apart for Jesus, but the situation started getting really tense. What was happening was word was getting back to government officials about Jesus, and they were beginning to consider him a threat. And this meant that Jesus understood that he only had, at that point, about a year and a half left in his ministry. I mean, he knew what was going on. He could see it. He knew what the process was. And so he knew and he understood that he had about a year and a half to finish training his disciples to do what he wanted them to do. And in the process of training his disciples, training us. So everything that we read about what Jesus is doing and what he's teaching and what he's saying has incredible purpose and meaning, because Jesus was not going to waste time. Now he has about a year and a half left, and what he does and what he says is so incredibly important for us to accept and to take and to apply in our lives. So what happens in this 24-hour period that we're looking at is critical. These two main things that happen in Matthew chapter 14 are so important to teach us about handling crisis and handling chaos in our lives. And what's going to happen is we're going to look at how to deal with the issues that there was really basically two commands that God gives through this, but they're both dealing with chaos. In one situation, in the chaos, God commands us to go. In another situation, in the chaos, God commands us to come to him. So let's take a look at these, and picking up with verse 13 of chapter 14. A large crowd has found Jesus up on the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee, and we pick up with verse 13. When Jesus heard what had happened, he knew that there was all of this murmuring and all this trouble that was developing and building. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. And hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. And when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. And as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." And Jesus replied, "I don't need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. And taking 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks, and he broke the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the people, and they ate and were satisfied. All the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over, and the number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So we can assume that there were somewhere maybe close to some 15,000 people there, maybe more. Jesus uses this very frustrating and discouraging situation for the disciples to teach them some very basic and primary truths about their ministry and really about our ministry.